Well, when I was approached with the concept of what this client was wanting to do on a Land Cruiser, I initially felt really good about it, knowing that a lot of weight and everything was going to be removed from the truck, and then the camper would be added. So with what we've already been doing on some of the 200 series, the whole premise behind the build was to build a higher performing Land Cruiser with some luxury living capability to it. So the suspension stuff always is kind of considered last. We kind of know what we want the truck to do. We have to know what it's got to carry, hence the camper and the furniture and the appliances inside, what that's going to weigh, where that weight is going to be. And then we can look at how the truck needs to be sprung, and then how the shocks need to be dampened, and the tire size that we want to run. All of that works together. So kind of knowing already what this client was wanting to do, we had a pretty good starting point. And then talking with Leif, at Enduro Campers about it, we kind of built the truck first, which is kind of opposite of what we tend to do with suspension. We built the truck first, and then we got the truck to him so he could work his magic on the camper. And then once we got it back, we could kind of fine tune certain things. And what we've got finished up is pretty sick. So when I referenced high performance suspension or a high performing Land Cruiser, the idea behind that is not to be blitzing a set of whoops. When you say long travel on something like this, it is longer travel than it was stock, quite a bit more travel than stock. And that travel also is dictated by where we want to stop the tire from compressing in its suspension stroke. So if we're going to run a 33 on this tire, maybe we set our limiting factor in compression a little bit less than what we would with a 35, because where we want the tire to stop. So either your bump stop is going to stop your tire, or your body's going to stop it. So with performance, higher performance means if you've got moving mass of a camper or anything, and you're on the highway, but then you need to evade an accident, or you need to dive into a median, what is that suspension going to do controlling that weight when you change the directions? But then when you send it through rough ground, how is it going to talk to that ground? And just by testing a lot of these trucks over kind of anything from rock crawling to highway speeds, we found a really good balance, and with how much weight it's got to carry and where that weight is placed. So when we say high performance, it is high performance compared to what your stock vehicle would be, with what it has to do, what its duties are. It handles speed better over, whoops and things like that, but you're not blitzing a set of whoops down in Baja like you would see a trophy truck doing, or a side-by-side. You've got to drive it within reason. You don't want to destroy all of your equipment, but the truck is more composed, and it can handle itself far better over stuff like that at speed, even going slow. So and that's all in the dampening and the shocks themselves. And that is a tunable thing too. So that is driver preference. You can set that the way, and that is personal preference. We will set it one way, and we can tweak it from there for the client, depending on their driving style and how they want it to feel. And that's changeable actually on the trip too. So where we are right now, you can have it set one way, and then if you're out on the freeway and you want to firm it up some, you can do that too, just by turning a knob. Some of the things that we needed to address big time with the Land Cruiser and some 4Runners, but with Land Cruisers in general, and with this one, is the big hurdle is the KDSS setup system in the factory in the vehicle for like the sway control. Like typically you'd have a mechanical sway bar, which is a spring that twists when the suspension hits something, or when you turn, to keep the body roll from rolling to the outside of your turn and keeping the truck leaning. That's done because the springs from the factory are very, very soft or lightweight springs, because they only have to support an empty vehicle, and the shocks are very soft as well. So shock load from the ground transferring into the truck, the sway bar, mechanical sway bar, keeps the truck kind of level when it's going straight, but when you turn, it keeps it level as you're turning instead of it leaning. So what we did with that, and this is just a personal thing, I don't like a computer or a hydraulic system linked with a computer like the KDSS system trying to counteract what's happening on the ground when I'm trying to drive somewhere, because it can change the way the truck handles. And it can do that in an unexpected way, because the driver is not in control of that. The driver can see what's happening on the ground. But when you have a computer sensing what's happening on the ground, that can throw things out of whack, and it can put you in a situation that you may not want to be in. Say coming into a tight switchback on a mountain downhill, you have a KDSS system that's trying to counteract what's happening on the ground, but you can see what's happening. So to me, I don't like surprises like that. You know, sometimes ABS can do that. You know, that's why ABS shuts off a lot of times when you're in four-wheel drive low. But with this truck, we've completely eliminated the KDSS system, and it is still a closed loop system to where there's no lights on in the dash, and the truck essentially thinks it's sitting on flat ground. But that means that there are no sway bars in this truck. Our spring rates are very different than it would be from stock. That supports the weight of the truck, and that also supports the weight of the truck in a turn. So that sway that you would see, like say in a trophy truck, if you watch a trophy truck turn, that has sway bars in it, but there's so much suspension travel that it has a lot of lean to it. And with this truck, it actually handles really, really well on very curvy mountain roads and tight switchbacks and things like that. But when you're at speed and you're driving and something changes on the ground, that energy, that tire that falls into a pothole or it falls off of something or compresses very hard, that tire can move independently on this side and your chassis stays flat. So you don't have a bar that's connected to your suspension moving up and down, transferring that energy into the chassis of the truck. So when you hit a bump, the suspension can move and the truck stays flat. And this side can stay flat too. So it's very predictable and the truck stays in a straight line. And when it's done right, you don't have bump steer, which means when you hit a bump, it steers you in that direction. You know, a lot of older vehicles tend to have a problem with that. And that is wheel offset and back spacing and, you know, tire size, and a lot of that stuff kind of plays into that. And steering geometry in the front all kind of plays together. But that's how important it is to have the correct dimensions on your wheels and the correct tire size for the amount of suspension travel you need and how much weight it's got to carry. All of this laundry list of things plays together to make the truck handle right. So when you remove a system like KDSS, being a hydraulic and a computer-driven system, you've got to have something to counter that. We had a backup plan to add a mechanical sway bar to this because the Land Cruiser's frame is set up to where we could do that. But I wanted to do a lot of testing first before we did that. And I don't feel like we need to because the Enduro Camper is so lightweight that when Leif removed the weight of the cab of the truck, there was a great deal of weight there that actually benefited us by adding the camper, because the camper itself it weighs less than what came off of there. But then when you put all the furniture and the fridge and all that stuff in it, the weight you're gaining is minimal considered at the end of the build. So, but that weight is directly over the axle and forward of the axle towards the front seats. Whereas if you look at like a Tacoma, short wheelbase Tacoma, 4-door short bed Tacoma like most people have, your weight is over the rear axle and behind it. So that acts as a cantilever, and then the frame is more flexible on a Tacoma than the Land Cruiser. So you've got a lot of benefits doing the 200 series like this, to where we can delete some systems. If we needed to, we can add some to make the suspension work right by knowing how much weight it's carrying and how much weight it's controlling. For tire size, we've been running a 35 with this particular configuration because it's very proportionate for the truck and for what you can realistically expect the truck to do. A lot of people just want to see how big of a tire you can stuff on something with little to no lift, like suspension adjustment. Anytime you change your spring rates, the truck is naturally going to sit taller if it's carrying the same load. So we have the truck basically set at 0 inches of lift and to run that tire size, a 35-inch tire. So we're about 1.5 inches wider per side than a stock Land Cruiser. And the wheel dimensions help us with keeping the wheels scrub radius centered more over your upper and lower uniball in the control arm, to where your pivot point over from your control arm is more centered up than a shallow offset or a shallow back spacing, say less than like 4 inches or whatever, pushes your wheel out away from that pivot point. So that is your scrub radius. Your wheel will actually swing at that point when you're steering. So what that does is that can push your tire back into your body mount or forward into your bumper. Whereas with the methods that we use, we have a 0 offset and a 4 3/4 inch back spacing that keeps that as close under the truck as we can get by being able to still add a wider tire without contacting the control arm, the upper control arm. But what that does is it allows that tire to pivot, and it, with a tire being, say, a 35-inch tall tire, it's not just tall, but it's long too because it's round. So when you take the length of that tire and you swing it under the fender well, and then you compress it when you're, say, rock crawling or dropping down into something, all the weight of the vehicle's on the front axle now, and you're turning it, you're compressing your spring, so that tire's got to have somewhere to move up into the fender well. Well, by pushing that stance a little bit wider, it pushes us away from the frame and away from the body a little bit for a larger tire to fit in there and cycle like it needs to. And if we physically could fit a 37 in there, but we'd have to limit it so much that the benefit of the 37 really wouldn't buy you much. I like sidewall height, and that's where a 37 comes in, is having a tall sidewall height. So when you air down, it's just like a cloud over chattery ground, whether you're going fast or slow. But we can get that with a 35-inch tire as well. If we were to run a 37 on this style of build, we got to think about how the truck's going to be driven. Would somebody realistically take this thing and use it in a manner to where a 37 would be justifiable? I don't know. That's on the client. But with the way it handles on the road, with the way it handles off-road, we're going to be doing some rock crawling testing with this thing. It's been in sand in New Mexico. We're out here at the cinders in all of this loose granules, and it's handling really, really well. The big thing is you've got to kind of think about the build or the truck's mission as a whole, where you, a client, would realistically take it, and if you can build it to exceed those expectations, then that's what we're after. We wanted the truck to do more than what the client is going to need of it. And by addressing tire size, that kind of goes along in with suspension travel and what's physically touching the ground. How much suspension travel can we get out of this to dampen the load that it's got to carry and keep it working right on the road, on and off road? And a lot of people will say that, well, they're not going to be rock crawling or they're not going to be in the mud and all that other stuff. Well, if they're taking it in the dirt, they will rock crawl it, they will put it in the mud, because there's things that come up that are out of their control, like a rainstorm, or out here in the desert when you can go 30 miles on dirt, there could be a flash flood that comes through one of these little river crossings that you've got to do, and now you find yourself rock crawling. The truck will need to do that, and that has to be built in. The capabilities of the suspension have to be able to perform in those areas really well, whereas you're not focusing on that demographic by itself. It's a camper, it's a luxury camper with all the amenities that you could want in a camper, but it's extremely lightweight, low profile, on a higher performing suspension than you would typically find on most vehicles. And that performance being the moving mass of a 35-inch tire has a certain amount of weight to it, and that can either hurt or benefit the way the truck handles at speed, because once that moving mass gets going, you've got to be able to control it. So that's where anywhere from the tire touching the ground to the wheel that the tire is mounted to the suspension that is controlling all of that, doing one thing, and then the suspension controlling the moving mass of the truck, all plays together. So that's why we chose a 35-inch tire for the width of the stance that we're running on this truck, for the weight it's got to carry, and for the sidewall height that we have when it's aired down to, say, 20 pounds of pressure, and how that's going to perform over different types of terrain. So for some of the componentry, like the body armor and things like that, and why we decided to go with like Descent bumpers, Descent makes a really killer bumper. It's kind of a modular bumper to a certain extent because of the way it gets assembled. But we tend to do certain things to any bumper we work with. Like if we want to light in a certain spot or something like that, it's a good platform for us to kind of build off of. We went with their modular front bumper with the bull bar. I really love that bull bar. It's a super lightweight bull bar. And it's, when you're behind the wheel, it's not intrusive. You don't see this giant bull bar. It covers the headlights like you would want it to. It doesn't look massive. It's just got a super, like a nice, tough, it's just got a really great aesthetic to it, but it's very functional too. And when you look at how they've put the flush mount body designs on there, a lot of people would think, well, because like in other bumpers, we typically have that same light pointing forward down the road as a usable fog light down the road. These are a flush mount, and it's more pointed to the shoulder, But what I found is, I was driving in front of this. If you have those on, even during the day, it's not intrusive on the person in front of you and their eyes looking back in the mirror. So if you don't have this blasting light in your mirror, like somebody's driving with their high beams on behind you, you see that it's there, but it's pointed out to the shoulders to where you behind the wheel, you don't see it during the day out off to the shoulders, but oncoming traffic can see it. So that would help if you're in a convoy of 2 or 3 vehicles or more and there's a ton of dust. The oncoming traffic on that same road can see that really, really well. So it's a very functional aspect of having those lights turned at an angle down low on the bumper as more of like a here I am kind of light. Whereas we have the Baja Designs LP9s on there, and that's for down the road, seeing down the road very, very far. So that for the front bumper, that's kind of what we enjoy doing with that. It's a very functional component for the front. Now for the rear is I'm really excited about. It's Descent's rear bumper that would accept dual swing outs that we've done before on other trucks, but we decided not to do the swing outs because we knew the camper was going to go on there. So I was working with the engineer over at Enduro Campers on how I wanted to incorporate a tire carrier with no moving parts, but it mounts into the location on that Descent bumper, which is held on by bolts. So there's no pivot, there's no hinge, and there's no reason for it because it's sitting on the back of the camper. But I wanted that to be the strongest component back there because it's holding the 35-inch tire, but it's also got a receiver in it to hold a bike rack with bikes on it. So you can imagine the weight that thing can see. And when you go off-road and that thing moves, it's moving as much as the truck is moving. Every bumper does it, but we wanted to minimize that movement as much as possible. So it's able to sit very close to the camper without hitting the camper. So if it got backed into a tree or something like that, it's also a protection piece for the back of the camper. Even though the camper could take a pretty serious hit, it's still there to protect the back end of the camper. And we can actually disperse other weight onto the camper itself. So we're going to be working on a couple different ideas. So recovery gear and things like that will actually be mounted to the camper itself and not on the tire carrier. So the tire carrier can hold the 35-inch spare, and it's extremely easy to use. So if you had to take the spare off, you can just undo the 3 lug nuts, just lean it towards you or just let it fall on the ground. But then to put the other one up there, there's a very easy and safe way to lift a tire that size and set it on the 2 rods sticking out. And those can take the weight of the tire. So you just stand it up, slide it right over that receiver portion, and you can spin the lug nut hole, the lug holes right to where they need to go and just slide it straight on and just run it down with the same socket that you would change the tire with on the truck. So we just wanted it to be ultra easy to use, up and out of the way, so you can actually really wheel this truck and be extremely strong. But another question we've already gotten is, why not stretch the frame and do all this other stuff and make it a 4-door? Well, we wanted to use a rear bumper that can go on any 200 series Land Cruiser that Descent off-road makes. So we're using a bumper that we've put on other trucks that were not modified this way. We're using the same sliders, we're using the very similar suspension components on a factory chassis. And there's a million reasons why we didn't want to cut the chassis of a 200 series, a 2021 200 series Land Cruiser, because it's not as simple as doing that to a 70 series Land Cruiser or an 80 series Land Cruiser. There are things that you'd have hundreds and hundreds of man hours into that. So to keep this truck a short wheelbase like we wanted it, to keep it as nimble as it is, a 2-person vehicle with the living capacity of, we had 4 adults just standing in there. The weather was nasty, so we're just hanging out, standing around. We all had room. It was amazing. So to have that kind of space in such a short wheelbase vehicle, and the balance of it is pretty phenomenal. Very, very happy with how that worked. But we wanted to be able to use components that we're, for one, familiar with. We didn't have to do one-off components with the bumpers and sliders and some of the suspension stuff. Leif and the guys at Enduro could handle the camper portion of it, and with our communication with each other, we can help balance this thing the right way. And that's why we wanted to use the body armor that we were from Descent and Metal Tech for the sliders and things like that. So these are just a few components that I wanted to touch on without going into too much detail, because we're going to cover that in the walk around. But I want Leif from Enduro Campers to touch on some of the key features that he puts into these campers, because I'm I'm extremely impressed with a lot of the thought process that goes into this and the attention to detail. And it's because he builds these for truck bed conversions, and this one has an actual pass through from the cab into the camper, and the way he put all that together is very, very impressive. And I'm extremely happy with being able to work with Leif on this, and we have plans on doing many other projects together like this, on Land Cruisers. And this is the very first one, so a lot of people are asking about four-door versions and other things, other vehicles and other platforms. So this is the first one, and we've got to start somewhere. And working with Leif on all this, it is just a starting point. So there's no telling what we'll be able to do in the future. Pretty excited about getting started with him on all this, and it's something to keep an eye on. He's going to fill everybody in on some of the key features of the camper itself.
Yeah, so when we were approached with this project, we're really excited. This is our first SUV-based camper, our first integration, and our first pass-through. Right, so it really starts with, how, structurally are we going to integrate this? We knew what the goals were for this from an off-road standpoint, performance standpoint, and making sure that the camper can match the performance of the suspension, that TAV has installed, and, and the goals for the customer. And then, with the structure that we've designed, we're really happy with it. And one of the other, challenges is where to actually make the cut and how much space do you give, as well as, you can notice there's a pretty short rear overhang. And so the whole project was about, making sure that we're maximizing the off-road potential, but also maximizing the camping space, the living space of the camper. We're putting a camper on here. We don't want to we want to maximize that camping space and storage space as well too. And so probably with the line in the chop, obviously you did some research. These are pretty common in Australia. But the main thing was making sure that the seats were in a comfortable position and could recline somewhat. Obviously they can't recline fully. There's cabinetry right behind it, but we wanted to make sure that the frame, that goes behind the cab that we installed clears the seats, clears your shoulders, making sure there's enough headroom. And that was really kind of dictated, but it also came down to stripping the cab and looking at what was structurally there and what we could work with and make sure that we could properly integrate with to make sure that it was structurally sound. And so kind of between all those two, we found, a cross member in the roof that was just behind the sunroof and kind of, picked it right there. And then, obviously drew that line through the door, and we've integrated the door into it. So those are some of the challenges too around how to make sure it looks integrated and clean. And so obviously we've, cut the rear door and grafted that onto the camper as well too. So some of those fabrication challenges were there. And then as well as the tire carrier as well too. So making sure that the tire carrier was structural and didn't have, too much of a cantilever, too much force going through. And so it has a pretty short overhang, but we wanted to make sure that there was storage in the back. And then when we go inside, you'll see the storage system at the rear that's based around the Step 22 Stingray boxes. And so really designing that around all in an integrated manner and making sure that we could fit all of the systems into it that we wanted. So it's full featured 18-gallon water tank, hot water heater, full plumbing system, sink, and all the proper storage that we really focus on in our campers is outdoor and indoor storage space. And so one of the challenges ultimately that right up front designing it that I was really nervous about, and which turned out to be correct, was really fitting all of the plumbing in there. And it's in a very, very tight space. And so that went through a lot of iterations, building that on the bench and designing it all to fit nicely where the valves are all accessible, everything's still serviceable, but still, packed into a very small space with the water filter, hot water heater, pump, accumulator, and all the correct valves, winterizing ports, all of that. So that was definitely a challenge. But other than that, it just goes back to what we do, building these campers. It wasn't anything, totally crazy for us. Really happy with the mounting solution too, underneath, really stout. But really not too dissimilar to what we do on the larger campers. But yeah, it's quite the it's quite the moment to take the cutoff wheel and the Sawzall to such a nice truck. So the basic construction is the foam core FRP sandwich panels. So it's a 1-inch core. And so those are lightweight on their own. So there's no frame. So it is essentially a monocoque design. So there's no aluminum framing whatsoever in the structure of the camper. So there's a proven, construction technique from Europe and Australia, and and we've had these on the road for a number of years. And the floor is a 2-inch honeycomb, so it's a really high quality honeycomb with a thicker fiberglass skin, so extremely stiff, extremely strong, but very lightweight for a floor. So no aluminum framing in the floor. And then on the interior side, to keep it light, so the shell weight is about 500 pounds, and then the total weight I think is just over 1,000 pounds. And we've removed over 800 pounds, about 800 pounds of weight from removing the cab of the truck, and then the seats and the interior and the rear doors and everything. So the net weight increase is pretty minimal. And so on the interior, it's primarily honeycomb. So it's a 3/4 inch honeycomb panel that's laminated for aesthetics, and then there's aluminum framing in there as well too. So it's pretty wild, but the entire interior build out. So we stacked all the honeycomb panels, and the interior, like laser cut pieces, is about 50 pounds. Like, is pretty wild. I'm not sure if that includes the countertops, but the countertops are 1/4 inch Richlite, and they are really light. And so you can get away with 1/4 inch Richlite because it's so stiff. It makes a great countertop material, very, very nice. And so the total interior is well under 100 pounds just from the cabinetry and the build out, which is wild. And the rest of it, in a camper, it's death by 1,000 cuts. You have your battery, your electrical, all the other components that go into it, and it just chips away and adds up to that 1,000 pounds. And then from a design standpoint, again, it goes back to the brief being an off-road priority focus, making sure that it wasn't too long. And so one of the differences you'll see is the overhang is shorter, and that was really dictated by, a total length, that the customer wanted to keep it under, but also for the tire carrier design too, to make sure that the tire carrier wasn't, cantilevered way out behind the camper to keep it, because the structure just gets too crazy when you have it cantilevered out that far. And so the tire carrier was really, what dictated that shorter overhang, as well as the total length of the vehicle. And then on the overhang, the front overhang, is dictated, aesthetically, it lines up with the top of the windshield. And then, obviously it's going to need a bed platform that comes down. And so we have a folding bed platform that's on gas struts that just lifts right up into the roof. No latching or fiddling necessary. It just raises and lowers essentially on its own with just minimal effort. And so that gives you a queen size bed up top. And so from a width standpoint, it only sticks out from the cab about 1/4 inch on each side. And so that was basically dictated. We said, okay, that's the width of it. And then at the rear, the descent bumpers, which obviously weren't designed for a camper, they're designed for the lines of a Land Cruiser. It's just barely overhangs the back of the descent. And then it's kind of hard to see, but there is a little bit of boat holing kind of shaped at the rear, just to kind of keep it smooth to those lines, as well as potentially if you slid down a rock, it's not going to just hang up on the rear too. And then on the outside, so one of the changes we've made on our campers, the last few campers that we've built, is we no longer put aluminum extrusions on the exterior to cap the walls. So it's all carbon fiber. So everything you see on it that's Raptor lined is all carbon fiber. And so we laminate carbon fiber, all the edges, which gives it, a permanent seal that, has the same thermal expansion properties as the fiberglass shell of the camper as well. And it's just completely sealed and permanent and super lightweight. And then the Raptor liner is just a really durable coating that's easily repairable as well too. And so that's what we do on all of our campers going forward, which also helps with a little bit of weight savings, from taking off that aluminum. But it just really makes it just a completely integrated unit that's all one, essentially a monocoque, because there's no frame. And so what else on it? Yeah, and then with the tent, we size it so that you can sit up in bed. So that's really important to us as well. Our campers, you can sit in bed, you can sit up, even being 6 foot. And then, yeah, queen size bed, like I mentioned, seating for 4 on the inside. And then on the other side, we always want to have some type of outdoor storage access. So we have a drop down door on the other side, which doubles as a table. And then that storage is all accessible from the inside. So it's a pretty good amount of space too. So we always like to have outdoor access storage on our campers. Storage is a really big priority for us and for the customer as well too. And so, yeah, I think that's the overall on the design of the camper. Yeah, so we wanted to stay with the vertical, pop top, primarily because it when you have a vertical pop top, the sleeping area up top is still usable space when you're not sleeping in it. So in a wedge, you can't really hang out up there, basically. You can't sit up there, at least or up against the front of it. And so it becomes usable space. We call it a lounge area during the day, and with this design, you can still step down in the rear. There's still a good amount of space, standing space on the floor when the bed is down, and you can hang out up there. This one's a little different than our larger campers, which have a fixed queen size bed that you don't have to move anything, but because of the size of this, we did have to do a moving bed platform, but you still have that ability to hang out up there. And even with the design on this lifting boards, which we'll see when we're on the inside, we put the hinge a little bit forward so you can still put your pillows, your bedding, maybe some jackets. You can still put some stuff towards the front even when it's lifted up. And so it's really just that, you're just adding usable space to the camper, even when it has a movable bed platform like this. And so that's really kind of why we stick with the vertical pop top and went with it on this, even though a wedge, could have been useful, but we like this a lot. Yeah, so I think the main reason this is a 2-door is, again, it goes back to the primary focus was off-road capability, right? And so, obviously mixed with camping comfort with a camper grafted to it. And so really it comes down to total vehicle length and, the customer's, intentions with the vehicle, knowing that it's going to be a 2-person usable, not going to be full timing in it with a family, that sort of a thing. And so when you look at it, this is essentially, we've created a 6-foot bed truck. And so as a company, we've made a decision that we will, at this time, only be doing 6-foot bed trucks, 6.5-foot bed on full size, 6 foot on the mid-size platforms. And so that's essentially what we've created. This is an 82-inch floor. This is essentially a 6-foot bed truck that we've created, right? And so that gives you the ability to have all of the camping amenities that you want, the indoor space that you need to seat multiple people and not have it be fully cramped. And so if it was 4-door, the rear door would be, I think it overlaps the wheel well slightly. The rear door would come to about here. You'd have a C-pillar here. And so your total, length, you would just be missing, so much of it. And so to extend it out this long to kind of get you back most of that camper area, you wouldn't really be able to do a tire carrier like this. You would have a much longer, departure angle, or much worse departure angle between the tire and the rear. And it also comes down to weight balance as well on the vehicle, especially when you get into a mid-size platform. Although this one is, fairly heavy, you have a weight balance issue if you're putting systems over the rear, so now you're unloading the front, and so that's really something that we think about as well too. And so that went into the design of this, with keeping the battery, water tank, and water system and the fridge all forward of the rear axle, which makes a big difference, especially off-road and on-road handling, to keep the weight centered on the vehicle. And so certainly anything's possible. I mean, people are doing, 4-door, sort of extended campers off the back. It's certainly possible. But again, this, with TAV and the customer, and with this build, it's a primary off-road focus. And anytime you build a camper, there's, you're moving the center of gravity a little bit, you're adding weight just by the inherent sort of design. You are making certain compromises with any time you're doing something like this, and the compromises on this the needle kind of went towards off-road, capability, and then the camper is compromised a little bit with, smaller rear overhang and some of those sort of front overhang to keep it into a compact, lightweight package. And so Yeah, anything's possible. And so on upcoming, so one of the next builds we're doing is on a Ranger, so a super cab Ranger with a 6-foot bed. And so they will have a very similar design to this. They'll probably have a longer front overhang. It'll probably have a little bit longer rear overhang because the customer doesn't need a tire carrier on the back, but the layout will be very similar as well too. So we can also do, so the mid-size trucks will be 6-foot bed Rangers, and the new Tacoma as well too. So that's one we're pretty excited about because they're keeping a 6-foot bed. Unfortunately, the Colorados and the new Ranger does not offer a 6-foot bed, so we are sticking to the 6-foot bed just because of we want to be able to accommodate all of the interior features, in our campers and stick with the design that we have and like.